welcome and to introduce the 8th recipient of the Harry F. Byrd, Jr. Class of 1935 Public Service Award, former Secretary of State, the Honorable James A. Baker III. Before doing so, I would also like to recognize and ask that they briefly stand U.S. Congressman Bob Goodlatte, past VMI Board of Visitors Presidents, Mr. Joe Spivey, VMI Class of 57, Mr. Tom Slater, VMI Class of 66, and current BOV members, Mr. Bill Boland, VMI Class of 73, Lieutenant General Charles Dominy, United States Military Academy Class of 62, and Mr. Scott Marsh, VMI Class of 81. Welcome to the Virginia Military Institute, the 7th Annual Leadership and Ethics Conference and this award ceremony. The themes of this year's conference, strategic leadership during times of global transition, past, present, and future, are playing before us even as we speak. Vast changes in the global economy, increasing competition between powerful nation states, violent actions of terrorist groups with global reach, the breakneck pace of technological innovation, and changing social mores are all contributing to a major transition in global affairs. The outcomes of this volatile transition are uncertain, certainly complex and highly ambiguous at this point. What we do know is that effective strategic leadership will be required to guide our nation toward a safe and prosperous now and in the future path. That kind of strategic leadership and understanding of the dynamic environment, developing a vision to guide others, building consensus with key players here and abroad, and managing the many changes that will occur along the path. No one better understands how to apply strategic leadership in volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous geostrategic environments than our distinguished guest today. The award that the Virginia Military Institute will bestow on Secretary Baker has been made possible by the generosity of the late United States Senator Harry Flood Byrd, Jr., VMI Class of 1935. It was established to honor distinguished public servants whose careers best characterize the ideals of the Institute: selflessness, integrity, patriotism, and courage. Its first award winner was former Secretary of the Army, the Honorable John O. Marsh, who is in attendance with us today and the nation's longest-serving Secretary of the Army. He also was president of the Board of Visitors at an earlier time. Where's Mr. Marsh? Right over here. Secretary Baker has held senior government positions under 3 U.S. presidents. He served President George H.W. Bush as the nation's 61st Secretary of State from January 1989 through August 1992, a period when the United States confronted the unprecedented challenges and opportunities of the post-Cold War, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the First Gulf War. His record of service began in 1975 as Undersecretary of Commerce to President George Ford. He served as the 67th Secretary of the Treasury from 1985 to 1988 under President Ronald Reagan. He served twice as White House Chief of Staff from 1981 to 1985 under President Reagan, and from 1992 to 1993 under President George H.W. Bush. Long active in American presidential politics, he led presidential campaigns for President Ford, Reagan, and Bush over the course of 5 consecutive presidential elections. He is a senior partner of the law firm of Baker Botts, LLP. He is the honorary chairman of the James A. Baker III Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. Speaking of this institute, Secretary Baker has said, quote, "My vision for the Institute is simple: to build a bridge between the world of ideas and the world of action," end quote. He also serves on the board of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and from 1997 to 2004, he served as a personal envoy of the United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan in seeking a political solution to the conflict in Western Sahara. In 2003, he was appointed the Special Presidential Envoy for President George W. Bush on the issue of Iraqi debt incurred during the tenure of Saddam Hussein. In 2005, he was the co-chair with former President Jimmy Carter of the Commission on Federal Election Reform. In 2006, he and former U.S. Congressman Lee H. Hamilton served as the co-chairs of the Iraq Study Group. And in 2008, he and the late Secretary of State Warren Christopher served as co-chairs of the National War Powers Commission. Secretary Baker received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1991 and has been the recipient of many other awards for distinguished public service. A native of Houston, Texas, Secretary Baker graduated from Princeton University in 1952 with a bachelor's degree in history. And after 2 years of active duty as a lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps, rising later to captain, United States Marine Corps Reserve, he entered the University of Texas Law School at Austin and graduated with honors in 1957. He and his wife, the former Susan Garrett, reside in Houston and have 8 children and 18 grandchildren. Please welcome Secretary Baker. And now I'd like to ask General Jumper and the Byrd family to come forward for the presentation of the Byrd Award. Everybody get a picture here. Secretary Baker.
Thank you very much, General P. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by telling you what an extraordinary pleasure it is for me to be here today and to accept this award named for my friend Harry Byrd. Harry and I usually saw eye to eye on the issues of the day, but I always respected his sharp intellect and his political skills, terrific political skills. And I really feel proud to be able to have called him my friend. So it's a pleasure for me to see Harry and Tom here today. And also a pleasure, a real pleasure for me to see my old colleague from the Gerald R. Ford White House days, Jack Marsh, whom you've honored before. Jack and I fought the battles of the last 2 years of the Jerry Ford administration, including the campaign against Jimmy Carter in 1976, where people don't realize it, but we only lost that election by 10,000 votes out of 81 million votes that were cast. In the Electoral College, if you turned around 10,000 votes in Iowa and Hawaii, Ford would have been elected president. Carter would never have been elected president. It was a challenging campaign. Ford started out 25 points behind, and the polls were absolutely even on Election Day. I'm delighted to receive this award. In a few moments, I'd like to say a word or two about leadership. And I got to tell you, folks, I think this is the perfect place for a discussion about leadership, because VMI has produced some of our nation's very finest leaders, like General George Marshall, General George Patton, and yes, Senator Harry Byrd. But first, I want to tell you a story about another fine leader that I know, or knew, still know actually, a guy named Al Gray, who was Commandant of the Marine Corps when I first became Secretary of State. Right after I was confirmed, I was sitting in my office on the 7th floor of the State Department, and my secretary comes in. She said, "There's a gentleman on the phone, says he's Commandant of the Marine Corps, wants to pay you a courtesy call. May I set it up?" And I said, "Of course You can set it up. And a couple hours later, in strides General Gray with 4 stars on both shoulders. It was all I could do not to stand up and salute. And he said to me, Mr. Secretary, I have a gift I want to give you here. I want to congratulate you on being Secretary of State, and I want to have a gift that I would like to leave with you. And he left a stack of business cards with me that were printed on Marine Corps camouflage background. And in the center, it said James A. Baker III, and in big letters, Marine Warrior. And at the bottom it said, and Secretary of State. So we had a good laugh about General Gray's suggestion that a Marine held more status than the Secretary of State. But the truth of the matter is that card implied the maxim of the old saying that there's no such thing as a former Marine. So today, more than 50 years after I last wore that Marine Corps uniform, I remain a Marine, and I will always be a Marine. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me say I doubt seriously that there's anyone in this room who, if you are being totally honest with yourself, isn't concerned about the brand of leadership that's today being displayed in and for our nation. One look at polling might convince you that we have a problem, if you had any doubts about that. In 3 months, the next President of the United States will be sworn into office with the highest unfavorable numbers in the history of polling. And both of the major candidates are distrusted by 3 out of every 5 voters, also records. There is similar angst among the international community as it has watched American leadership wane in recent years, creating vacuums around the globe that bad actors scramble to fill. And so it is only fitting, I think, that you've asked me to say a word or two about leadership today. But let me start at the very beginning. Exactly what is leadership? A lot of time people have difficulty defining that. The historian James McGregor Burns defined leadership as 2 things: a commitment to values and the perseverance to fight for those values. Let me repeat that. A commitment to values and the perseverance to fight for those values. I guess I would say the same thing, but in a little different words. Because leadership, I believe, is nothing more than knowing what to do and then doing it. For example, I would submit to you that leadership is Alexander Hamilton establishing the creditworthiness of the United States by persuading the Congress to pay Revolutionary War debts that might have been avoided legally, if not morally. Leadership is Thomas Jefferson deciding to buy the Louisiana Territory from France, which spread our fledgling nation across this continent. Leadership is Abraham Lincoln fighting to preserve the American Union. And leadership is George Marshall advocating for the rebuilding of Europe in the aftermath of World War II, including America's enemies during that war. Today, I'd like to offer for your consideration 2 other specific and more recent examples that I think illuminate leadership. The first was provided by President Ronald Reagan, whom I was privileged to serve for 8 years after running 2 campaigns against him. I'm not sure that'll ever happen again in American politics, but I was privileged to serve this fine man for 8 years. By 1980, with memories of Vietnam and the Iranian hostage crisis fresh in our country's mind, it was really not clear in those days that the United States was willing to speak up for its interests and values, much less forcefully defend those interests and values. The Cold War had dragged on too long, many thought. Now it was time to reconsider, maybe, Maybe we had overestimated the danger. Maybe we could find some sort of an accommodation. But President Reagan saw it differently and I think a lot more clearly. What then is our course? The President asked in his famous 1982 speech to the British Parliament. Must civilization perish in a hail of fiery atoms? Must freedom wither in a quiet, deadening accommodation with totalitarian evil? The answer, President Reagan said, was to simply stay the course. He said if we did, communism would fall. Communism would fail. It was destined, President Reagan said, for the ash heap of history. I remember the furor that greeted President Reagan's speech and others like it, like when he called the Soviet Union an evil empire. His critics' favorite epithet was that he was simply a shoot-from-the-lip cowboy, unmindful of the complexities of foreign policy and potentially more dangerous than the adversaries that he condemned. In the language of international relations, it was feared that he had abandoned the principle of realism, that is, the view that our policies should serve our national interests, in favor of Wilsonianism or idealism, the view that we should harness our policy to the aims of national values or morality. But the truth of the matter was, Reagan was doing both. His rhetoric made the case for staying the course, but his strategy was straight out of the book of Realpolitik. One element of that was a large defense buildup. It was called peace through strength. Another was support for anti-communist resistance forces around the world. A third was diplomacy that emphasized plain talk over euphemisms and verifiable progress over vague compromise. And then, as the Soviet Union embraced glasnost and perestroika in the late 1980s, the final element of that strategy, to the dismay of Reagan's critics, was to support the Soviet reformers and to reduce tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. All questions about this strategy, ladies and gentlemen, were finally and fully and quite forcefully answered on November 9, 1989, because that is the date when East and West Germans took sledgehammers to the Berlin Wall and began pounding it into the ground. The Cold War was over. The West had won. Why? Because Ronald Reagan knew what to do, and he did it. And that brings me to my second case study, the first President Bush, whom I was privileged to serve as Secretary of State. Even though the West was triumphant after the Iron Curtain had fallen, the Bush administration's strategy was to reject triumphalism. Figuratively speaking, he refused to dance on the remains of the Berlin Wall. He simply would not humiliate a former foe. He simply would not humiliate Moscow, because he knew that while the Soviet bear was mortally wounded, it remained strong, and it remained armed with enough nuclear weapons to spark the nuclear holocaust that the world had feared since the end of World War II. Instead, under President Bush's leadership, we reached out and we built strong diplomatic relations with the leaders of the Soviet Union. Then we negotiated what we call the mother of all soft landings, freedom throughout Eastern Europe and Central Asia, the reunification of Germany as a member of NATO, and the peaceful breakup of the Soviet Union. We also struck arms control deals that greatly reduced the number of nuclear weapons that both sides had. So the Cold War ended with a whimper and not with the bang that many people had feared. And the world became safer. Why? Because George Bush knew what to do and because he did it. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, world events call for leadership because the challenges the next president will face are truly daunting. The Middle East is a complete mess in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. Russia is spreading its influence across the map, and China has emerged as our biggest rival on the world stage. 8 years after the Great Recession of 2008, our own countries and the world's economies remain very shaky. Meanwhile, international terrorism and climate change loom as global challenges that are going to require some global solutions. Now, I would not suggest that the United States alone, nor even a small group of developed countries, has the wherewithal to effectively address all of these and other challenges. That's going to demand the sustained cooperation of many on the international stage. But American leadership will be a critical component of coordinating the myriad of major efforts that are going to be required. Quite simply, my friends, the United States cannot lead from behind, and it should not be asked to. Leading from behind, after all, is an oxymoron. Fashionable, perhaps, in the parlors of Washington, but not in the real world of action. Although America's track record has had its weak moments, we have, when you think about it, my friends, historically been a positive force for stability and for freedom around the globe. We don't want to mess around in anybody else's sandbox, and we are not in it for territory. During the past century alone, we have fought 4 wars, 3 hot ones and a cold one, and we've never asked for anything but enough ground to bury our dead. We need to get back to that brand of leadership. We desperately need to get back to that brand of leadership. We need to learn to lead again, because if we do, then we can be certain that others will follow. And if we don't, you can be equally certain that unsavory actors less intent on global stability will be more than willing to take our place on the world stage, not unlike the situation today with Russia in Syria. So a lot is at stake, ladies and gentlemen, because the history of the 21st century will be determined by the quality of leadership that America provides in the coming years. Thank you for this prestigious honor, and thank you for having me today.
Secretary Baker will now take a few questions before we conclude the event today. Secretary Baker.
Who's gonna? I won't be able to see who's. Yeah. There's somebody up there. It's hard to do this in this big.
Secretary Baker, you spoke of Russia and the situation there. How do you see the United States going forward with Syria and Russia?
What do we do with Russia going forward?
In
well,
Syria.
you know, we were very hopeful. We were very hopeful when the Cold War ended, the wall collapsed, and the Soviet Union actually imploded and became 13 independent countries rather than one empire. And for 15 years after that, we worked very closely with the leaders of the Russian Federation, at that time, Yeltsin and Putin. And they worked closely with us for about 15 years. And then I suppose that things began to change domestically, internally in Russia. You know, a lot of political leaders around the world come to power by pointing the finger at outside threats to the country. And it was easy for him to point the finger at NATO and to point the finger at the United States of America. And I think that that's what's happening now. I've worked with him. This is a man that really only understands strength and resolve and determination. And as I said before, he's not going to accept leading from behind. We need to lead from in front. So when we get buzzed by Russian aircraft, when they buzz our patrols in the Baltic Sea and so forth, I think we need to respond quite vigorously and quite effectively. I remember that the Turks shot down a Russian fighter jet not long ago that went into Turkish territory, and while they griped a lot about it, that was about all that happened. But I think we need to be more forceful and more determined in our approach to Russia. I think the leader has decided he wants to recreate the near abroad and make Russia once again into a competing superpower with the United States. We need to reassure our allies, particularly in the Baltic states and in Eastern Europe, those most especially who are members of NATO, because we are obligated by treaty to come to their defense if Russia should attack them. So I think we need to be a bit more forceful.
Good morning, sir. I'm Cadet Conrad. And my question is, throughout your career, how have you been able to leverage your personal and professional relationships with other world leaders to promote common interests?
Yeah. People talk to me, ask me that question a lot. And what I say is this, it is incredibly important, particularly when you're negotiating for your country, that you have the best possible relationship you can with your interlocutor across the table. And if it's possible to develop a feeling of trust on both sides, you've got a hell of a lot better chance of reaching an agreement. That does not mean that you would ever sacrifice the interests of your country in order to establish a relationship of friendship with the other person you're negotiating with. But it certainly makes it a whole lot easier. I experienced that in my relationship with the then Soviet Foreign Minister, Eduard Shevardnadze. We began to find that we could trust each other, trust what we said, that we didn't leak on each other. We didn't say one thing at the table and something else later on. If you can establish that personal kind of relationship, it'll help you a lot in getting things done diplomatically and from a political standpoint.
Secretary Baker, my name's Easley Moore. How do you view the implications of the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership vis-a-vis China?
Yeah. Well, I'm a big supporter of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I have a policy institute at Rice University, as you might have noted from the introduction. It's a very fine institute down there, and we just sponsored a program where the special trade representative of President Obama came down and talked about TPP, and we supported it. And I'm a strong believer in free trade. It has to be fair trade, of course. But I've seen it work. I negotiated the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, which was the forerunner of NAFTA. I do not agree with either of our current presidential candidates in their opposition to the TPP. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is not important only as an economic agreement. It's important as a strategic agreement. Because if we are unable to get that ratified by our Congress, then China is going to accede to a lot of the elements of our leadership role in Asia. So there's a huge strategic component at stake here, which I think was pretty much the thrust of your question. And we ought to, you know, it's regrettable, and it used to be that in this country, the left wing of the Democratic Party and the right wing of the Republican Party were solid behind free trade, so there was a consensus for free trade. Free trade generates economic activity, and that's how you create jobs, greater economic activity. So it's really important that this be gotten through the Congress. I think President Obama is going to try to do it during the lame duck session. I hope he will. I've been in conversations with his White House Chief of Staff about it, and I've told him if there's any way I can help, I want to help. It's a very important thing for the United States.
Let's take one final question.
Hello, sir. I had a question again regarding China. Recently, the president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, has been moving closer to China diplomatically. How do you, since the Philippines is a historic ally of the United States in the South China Sea area, how do you think we should respond to that?
Well, I saw that too. I also saw some of the things he said about some of our leaders in the United States, and I don't agree with any of that either. The best way for me to answer we've had a long and close relationship with the Philippines. We have a security agreement with the Philippines. The best way for me to answer your question about what the current leader of the Philippines did in China when he said, I'm walking away for a little bit from the relationship with the United States, is to recount an incident that happened to me when I was Secretary of State. I got a call from Corazon Aquino, who was then the president of the Philippines, and she said, our people want you and your forces out of Subic Bay and out of Clark Field. It's become a terrible political problem for us. And we said, I talked to President Bush, and we said, look, we don't want to be anywhere we're not wanted. You want us out, we're leaving. So we left Subic Bay and we left Clark Field. It wasn't 8 months later that China marched into an island in the Spratly Islands, I think it was, claimed by the Philippines, and put the Chinese flag down. And we got a call from the president of the Philippines saying, hey, China's put this flag down on our territory. We have this security agreement with you. What are you going to do about it? We said, well, we're not going to do anything about it because we don't have the assets to do anything about it because you've asked us to leave. So I hope that the president of the Philippines will rethink this strategy and this policy, because at the end of the day, I think that he's going to find that they're going to rely a lot on U.S. leadership and U.S. friendship, which has been there for many years between the United States and the Philippines. Thank you all for having me this morning.
Thank you for attending today. The Corps of Cadets will honor Secretary Baker with a full dress review at 1:30 p.m. this afternoon. Thank you very much.